Hi, HR Nation. Welcome to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, the show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives from the world's leading global brands. Today, we're joined by Dr. Zara Nanu, who's the CEO and co-founder of Gapsquare. Zara, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, thanks. Good.
Thanks for joining us. Before we jump in, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself personally and your journey to where we are today.
Yeah, so my background is a little bit different than I think what this podcast is usually used to. I don't come from the world of HR. I come more from the world of policy and human rights and social justice. And I've worked for many years, over a decade, in the space of women's rights, worked for different charities and nonprofits around empowering women around the world to prevent them from being trafficked or to help them reintegrate back into society after being in the criminal justice system, or young women who are not in training or education or employment, to support them to find what their career path would look like. And although it was very rewarding, that job, the thing that struck me many times is how disjointed that world is from the private sector and from the business world, and how things operate in the economy and how things operate with money. So we have this world where I was here in the charity sector, where we were talking about empowering women and giving women access to equal opportunity. And then we have this world operating here, which is the actual real economy in the world, that oftentimes didn't include women that much and was continuing with business as usual without actually integrating any of the agenda from this world. About 4 years ago, I thought, is there a way in which we can bring these two together? Is there a way in which we can bring a lot of that empowerment, a lot of that access to money and access to the economy for women into the private sector? Because a lot of research is showing there's benefits to that. When more women participate in the economy, when more women get involved in businesses and in companies, those companies become more productive, their bottom line increases, their share price grows. So there's a lot of benefits overall to everyone. And that's how I sat down with my co-founder and we set up Gapsquare so that we can develop a cloud-based software as a service that helps businesses understand where exactly they have gaps in terms of diversity in their company and how they can address those going forward, where exactly they are unequal, maybe unfair in some way to their employees, and how they can bridge those gaps in order to build more trust with the employees, attract top talent, retain that top talent, and ultimately build more inclusive, productive companies for the future.
Just sort of take it back a second. I love the work that you guys do. Where did the passion for this work come from for you personally? Where did that stem from?
I come from a family of very strong women. And so my mom was in the education sector. Both my grandmas were in kind of higher education too. And so inevitably, I think there was a trajectory in there where I was going to do something around education. I didn't do anything related to education. However, I always had a passion for kind of more inclusiveness for women and more equality for women and disadvantaged people. And I've spent all of my career to date working in this space.
Pretty amazing. So what's really occupying your mind on a sort of a day-to-day basis?
I think that there's a bit of a dichotomy in terms of how do we make a lot of the equality actually make sense for business, because business needs to operate and needs to make money. That's what it's there for. So how do we translate all of this around empowerment and bringing more women on board, bringing more people of different ethnic minority groups on board? Do we translate that into a language that makes sense for business, and into a language that actually makes business understand that this is not a nice to have. This is not a tick box. Let's do a tick box so that we can look good to the world. This is actually imperative to business success. Research is showing that by 2025, over 60% of the workforce will be women and BME populations. So businesses really need to think about how they're going to make their world more inclusive for those groups if they want to succeed, if they want to make sure that they build products, they build services, and they build companies that work for everyone.
Yeah. Well, why do you think, we had this conversation when we first spoke, that so many companies are avoiding this conversation? In many cases, they're ticking the boxes, as you said, but they're really avoiding, deep diving into it. Why is that?
Well, I think it's an important question, especially because we're coming up to Equal Pay Day, and I think the equal pay piece of the work is what's holding a lot of businesses back, because they're worried that they might have unequal pay within their businesses, and then that would require a lot of resources to fix. And rightly so, it usually does take a lot of resources to fix. But for every 1 year of not doing anything, the cost to the company increases by £460,000. And that's a lot of money. 1 year of inaction will cost you almost £500,000.
Wow.
So companies really need to think about it, the kind of the cost benefit of it. Yes, there will be a cost if you find out that there are equal pay issues and there are inequalities in pay. There will be a cost. But equally, you're accruing more to your cost by not doing anything every year.
Mm-hmm. Could you take a second just to share the difference between gender pay gap from equal pay?
So it's an important issue. I think a
Yeah.
lot of people are getting really confused about the different terms. So we have things like the gender pay gap, which has been in the news a lot in the world, in the UK in particular, because companies need to report on the gender pay gap on an annual basis, starting with 2017. And that's more about comparing averages. You're comparing the average man in the company with the average woman, and you're comparing the pay per hour. So how much does a man get paid per hour versus how much does a woman get paid per hour? And that difference in the UK is at around 18% overall across all roles, both full-time and part-time. Equal pay is more about people doing the same job. So people doing the same job with the same responsibilities should be paid the same. And that's been legislation in the UK for about 50 years. Unfortunately, practice shows, and the many cases in employment tribunals show that that's not necessarily always the case. But people doing the same job should be paid the same, and that's an equal pay issue. And then an added dimension to that is actually equal pay for equal value, which is a new thing that's coming in. And you might have heard of different cases like with Sainsbury's and other supermarkets in employment tribunal, because they pay people at checkouts differently than what they pay people in the warehouse. And what their employees are actually saying is that they bring the same value to the supermarket and they should be paid the same. And it doesn't matter if you're at the checkout or if you're in the warehouse. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, it mattered because the work in the warehouse was more physically demanding. But with the advancement of technology and automation of a lot of those jobs in the back, the arguments are that these jobs actually are not very dissimilar and in effect bring the same value to the company. So it's interesting times, because the cases are currently in employment tribunal, and we're going to see in the next couple of years where that takes us and what that means for employment and how companies remunerate their employees. Is it still based on how many hours you've worked in what job, or is it project based and value based? So it's a really interesting conversations for the future.
And we are seeing companies move more towards a project-based approach in terms of their businesses to become more agile. So that's going to become more of the norm now, which is why it's important that we clarify what that looks like and what that means for people. What I love about what you guys do is you're approaching this all from a data point of view, right? You have the analytics to back it up. This isn't a fluffy conversation, right? This is, being empowering HR leaders and leaders in the business to act. Can you talk about how you're leveraging data technology to achieve parity at work quicker?
So I think this is a really interesting question, because usually diversity and inclusion is kind of confined into the space. Oh, let's talk about it and mention how important it is, and then everybody moves on with their jobs.
Exactly.
Or let's appoint someone to be a diversity and inclusion manager, and they will have no access to any budget, but they'll run International Women's Day once a year, and everybody will be happy that something has happened. It's also a very contested issue. So you have usually a lot of emotion and a lot of debate in companies about what should happen. Do we set quotas? Do we set targets? What is positive discrimination? Does that leave out other groups? Like, how do you make sure that you're actually building something more inclusive that works for everyone and ultimately works for the company and makes the company more productive and makes the company more solid and relevant in the 21st century? The data is actually, interestingly enough, has been the answer to that. And we've seen it through our software, because you can have a lot of emotion, you can have a lot of politics, but actually when you sit down in front of your dashboard and you see what gaps you have in what departments or what grade levels, it all becomes more real, it all becomes more tangible, and ultimately becomes more doable. It's not that kind of mountain that you need to climb in order to make something happen. It's actually something that you can do through everyday steps and introducing little tiny change that will have a really big impact. So we help companies through our software look at their payroll and HR data and understand how those gaps are happening, why they're happening, what explains their gaps, and what actually doesn't explain their gaps, and where they can focus their attention in the immediate future versus the longer term future, and how they spend their resources and how they make change happen.
I suppose everyone's thinking as well is, who are you working with in terms of, from a technology standpoint, to bring this all together and get that data?
Our preferred way to work is to partner with large software providers. So we partner currently with Oracle, with the Human Resources Cloud, so that we can get the data through more easily for our customers and can have a continuous kind of integrated approach to looking at different gaps and creating more fair workplaces, and helping HR managers, but also reward and compensation managers to understand what practices work for inclusivity and what practices they need to change in order to make their workplaces more inclusive. The thing about data is that it also helps us understand this space a bit more. Like, there's a lot of dichotomy in the world about whose fault is it that we live in an unequal world, and there's a lot of research and a lot of conversation that looks at the women for blame in terms of women don't want to advance in their careers, women don't want to go and work full time, women don't want to be on the board because it requires lengthy work hours and it requires extra time at the weekend. So, or women lack the confidence to do that. You see a lot of conversations around that, and even a recent Alison Rose review that looked at women in business kind of highlighted that kind of movement towards women lack the confidence and women lack the desire to be out there, put themselves forward. But data is actually showing that there's another side to the coin. There's a side to the coin where there's specific structural inequalities within a company that have barriers in place that are more difficult for women to overcome, no matter how big their confidence is.
Yeah.
It could be that in a specific department, over the past 10 years, you can see that only men have been appointed as heads of that department. And then it becomes a question of, well, is it actually an equal opportunity? Is this open to everyone? And how can we use data to identify those pinch points and see how we can address them collectively?
In terms of the different partners, why Oracle? So many different partners out there. It's a bit of a minefield for everyone. Why did you partner with Oracle on this? What was it about Oracle that made sense?
The thing that made sense was that we're based in Bristol, and Oracle runs an accelerator program, and we applied to be on it. And once you're on the Oracle accelerator program, you get access to cloud credits, but also a support network in terms of connecting to businesses within the Oracle network, connecting to the relevant platforms. In our case, it was the Human Resources Cloud, identifying routes to market, channels to market together. So that partnership has kind of flowed naturally over the past year and a half.
So I didn't think there was more to it then. I'm glad I asked that question. So there's multiple reasons of why. Whose responsibility is this in the business? That's a question that keeps coming up more often now. Is it HR's responsibility? Is it, the D&I team? Whose responsibility is this in the business?
I mean, I think it depends on what you mean by responsibility. Ultimately, it should be the CEO's responsibility to create and forge a culture and a company that is more inclusive and diverse. And that agenda can then trickle down into all the relevant departments. HR and reward and compensation would be the first point of contact, but then all the others too. And it requires collective thinking, really.
Yeah.
It's not a standalone issue in order to move this forward.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. It needs to come from the top.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why I asked that question, because it's important. Because a lot of times it's like, oh, it's a HR issue. You know, in any company, it's like, oh, HR will deal with it. But I don't believe that's that. Yes, HR has a role to play, of course, but it's not a HR issue.
Yeah.
It's a leadership team issue. It's the CEO issue.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we see increasingly more and more boards take note of this agenda and actually require the CEO to come with reports at every board meeting to show where the gaps are and how the company is addressing that. So that's been really, really interesting. We've seen companies push this into the corporate social responsibility agenda. And I think that's actually detrimental to it, because this is not a let's make the world a better place. This shouldn't be competing with the company allocating resources to making the office more green, or this is not about the kind of a charitable work. This is important for business's success. This is important for the business to be able to operate tomorrow, to create products and services that are innovative, that work for everyone and to be successful.
Mentioned in our first call the Trailblazer Salesforce story. Could you share that?
Yeah, it's been really interesting because it's been in the news a lot lately, and I think a lot of the companies have been watching how Salesforce has been addressing their gender pay gap. They've been very vocal about it. So a few years ago, they ran an equal pay audit, a gender pay audit, to identify what the gaps are. I think initially they were saying that because they thought that there are no gaps, and ultimately identified that there are quite significant gaps, and they needed something like $3 million to close those gaps and address those gaps. So a lot of people's salaries got increased. I'm assuming a lot of women's salaries got increased. And they have created that kind of parity. And then a year down the line, when they ran another report to monitor progress and kind of reaffirm that, yes, they've corrected everything, they were $1 million short of equal pay. So within those 12 months, because it's a large company, because it has tens of thousands of employees, and because of churn rate and because of people leaving and new people coming, and the fact that the culture is still that culture of a tech company that is not very inclusive, that is male dominated, it's very likely that within a year you will get to missing that, having a $1 million gap. Research from Gartner shows that for any company, for the average company, that gap grows by 460,000 a year. It's real and it's happening. This is why looking at data, and actually looking at data on a monthly basis, on a payroll by payroll basis, and bringing that together with HR data helps companies prevent those gaps and address those gaps before they happen.
I love your point there, because you just pointed out that it's a culture shift, not we look at the end of the year, there's a gap, we make up the gap, because that doesn't solve. That's like putting a Band-Aid on the problem as opposed to actually solving it. And love what you're saying is about using data on a monthly basis to keep a pulse on what's happening in the business, and then and do it that way. Is that where Gapsquare comes in? Is that where your software can help these companies?
Yes. So this is exactly why we've set up the company and are developing our product, so that we can have an integrated approach to fairness and pay fairness in particular right now, so that we can automate that process, and companies don't have to think about equal pay anymore, and they don't have to think about fair pay or equal pay for equal value or any of that, because it's automated, it's happening in the background, and they can focus on productivity. They can focus on making teams work. They can focus on having diverse teams that work together, have a culture fit, but equally disrupt. So they can focus on the important things that can help them and their employees grow.
Yeah, and they have the data to bring into the boardroom to have those conversations to back it all up, right? It's no longer just this is how I feel conversation. Here it is, black and white. You can't argue with that. How do you overcome potential biases in data?
That's a very interesting conversation, and it's actually at the heart of a lot of our work, because we have two kind of biases, well, multiple levels of biases. We have bias in data, indeed. Examples from the past 2 years have shown that when companies just use existing data in HR and build algorithms for recruitment or algorithms for career progression, they end up picking up on those things from their data, like that men belong in senior roles, that women don't belong in engineering. So the tech ultimately picks up on those things and progresses inequality in a way. So this is why we're very mindful of it, and we understand that data comes in biased, and we need to control for factors that come in the data when we develop our algorithms that can make projections and predictions about where things should be going in the future. And it's also about the algorithms that we use, because ultimately a lot of them, like pre-packaged algorithms that we could be using, have been developed by predominantly white, middle-aged, middle-class Californians. So we need to be mindful of that when we adopt them in and actually look at them and scrutinize them to understand how they could be biased.
How do you recommend, or any advice for companies of how to best communicate this message to their employees?
The main thing is communicate. So at least communicate.
I love the way you're like, the first step to communicating is actually communicating. It's a fair point.
We still see a lot of companies, and we talk to a lot of employees who are saying, well, I have no idea what the gaps are because they've never been communicated to us. And the only way we can see what the gaps within our company are, particularly in the UK, is if we go on the Government Equality's website, where all companies need to report their gaps on an annual basis, and that's where they see them. And I think that's a really not the ideal way for your employees to find out what the gaps are. I think there are ways we're 2 years into reporting legislation, and by now we have no illusion about the fact that pay gaps exist. 11,000 companies in the UK have reported pay gaps. Most of them have reported a gap in favor of men. So it's not about hiding behind the numbers or hiding and saying, oh, I don't know if we have a gap. It's about actually collectively understanding together that the gap is this, but we're actually going to work over the next 10 years to get it to this, and we can do it together. And I think taking employees on this journey becomes really important, and that's how you end up engaging them. That's how you end up actually creating stronger, more relationships of trust and transparency with employees, and ultimately any HR department will confirm that this is good. When you build trust with employees, when you build those relationships that work for everyone, that's when a company can thrive.
I completely agree with you. And it also seems that the new workforce is coming into the workplace are even more so expect transparency from the business.
Yes.
The new generation coming in, they want full transparency. We're seeing that now. So it's even more important to attract the best talent as well, right? You're not going to attract the best talent also if you don't have that transparency.
Yeah. I mean, that's why we've seen the use of Glassdoor has been going over the roof over the past decade, because people are really interested to see how much other people are being paid. And that's why they're sharing the information about how much they get paid. And that transparency is actually creating increased churn rates for companies and increased kind of move of employees. So Glassdoor, I think, was showing that 52% of employees would leave their job if they looked on Glassdoor and they saw that they're not being paid fairly. 52%. And that's a lot. That's half of your workforce. On top of that, a majority of those employees would be in your senior roles, which means you've spent a lot of money on recruiting them, or you've spent a lot of money on growing them in the company to that senior role, and then losing them makes absolutely no sense. But we do live, that highlights how we do live in a world of transparency. And millennials, generations X and Y, they're very interested in fairness. They're very interested in transparency. They are more open than older generations to talk about pay and share pay information with each other. So this is a new territory for a lot of the businesses, and they need to come to grips with that.
Yeah. Could we switch the conversation as well to equal leave for parents? Because as a new parent myself, I now have a newfound appreciation for what that really means. Could you talk about that? Because you made some really good points in our last conversation.
When we look at the data that we've had over the past 4 years, we see that the gender pay gap starts accelerating for women when they're past the age of 30. So once they hit 30, the gender pay gap almost starts to double every year. It's 3% initially, which seems quite small, 3%. But then it becomes 6, 12, 24, up until it gets, especially if you add, like we've discussed before, the length of service and loyalty into a company, the gaps get even higher. And a lot of it is linked to parental leave and women taking time off to care for their children. Now, in the UK, we've had shared parental leave legislation for a few years now, but the uptake of men of shared parental leave is very small. Percentage-wise, we're still in the single digits, I think. That is quite a big issue. And the reason that is happening is, although legislation allows for shared parental leave, a lot of businesses offer benefit packages for parental leave only to the women rather than women and men. So if you're a woman going off on parental leave, you're likely to get a package that will pay you, say, a certain amount over the next 6-9 months. Whereas if you're a man, you pretty much get statutory parental leave. So from that point of view, then the economy and the numbers don't add up to actually create an equal opportunity for both parents to take time off. And we've seen, actually, I was talking to the head of rewards from Aviva the other day, and they have introduced shared parental leave benefits. They're the same benefits for everyone. It doesn't matter who takes the leave. They get, if they take the leave, they get the benefits. And within 3 years, they've reached 50-50 take up on parental leave.
Wow. That is amazing.
So that case, I think, is not shouted about enough, because
that is amazing.
It shows how actually, if you open those benefits and you make those benefits available across genders, parental leave will become a thing that both parents take. And then that will have equal impact on their pay and when they're on their career progression, and not only on one of the parents.
And also, like you said a minute ago, also the loyalty to the company. Right, as well. Absolutely. Right. Just the fact that they give you that time. I said to give you that time off. You deserve it anyway, to be honest. No one's giving you time off. Right. That, for me, that would mean a lot.
And it's really interesting. I think the dynamic is shifting because, again, research about millennials and the younger generations is showing that the men want to take equal time off to care for their families, and they want to spend equal time with their children. So there's the kind of generational difference when you look at the men who are coming into the workforce and want that shared parental leave and want to have time off to care for their family, or even if they don't have children, they want to have the time to be able to do things that they enjoy outside work.
Could you talk more about the global legislation around equal pay? Because that's such an important conversation as well.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we have Equal Pay Day coming up in the UK on the 14th of November, and that's a day that's, I want to say celebrated, not necessarily celebrated, each year to highlight and raise awareness about equal pay and the need to create equal pay within employment. When you look at equal pay, the UK has had legislation for nearly 50 years now that requires people to pay to be paid the same if they do the same job. Similar legislation has been in existence in the US, in most US states. Most European states have legislation around this. And I think so most businesses would be aware of how they need to pay employees fairly. When you look at gender pay legislation or ethnicity pay legislation, the one that compares averages, the governments around the world are also bringing in legislation around it, because research coming out of Harvard University is showing that countries that have legislation around gender pay actually make more progress on creating equality within businesses and within the private sector. So countries like the UK have introduced legislation around the gender pay gap. France has introduced legislation around the gender pay gap. The French legislation is a little bit more punchy than the UK one, in that it actually sets a target of eliminating the gender pay gap and sets penalties for companies who don't decrease their gender pay gap. Canada is introducing legislation that is, I think, going to mirror the UK legislation. Legislation is coming in Ireland. Germany has had this legislation for a few years now that allows employees to come into the HR department and say, can you tell me now what the difference is in pay for my grade? And the HR department needs to come back to them and say, this is the difference. So legislation is coming in around the world, and this is actually having a big impact on multinational companies that have offices around the world and need to start keeping up with this overall. And the answer to that is just generally creating more transparency and generally adopting a strategic kind of view that they're going to become more inclusive, more equal in pay, and create that parity.
During this podcast, I feel like we've covered a lot, but anything else, any tips and tricks that we could share?
I think the key thing is that it's actually a lot of the people who've started working on using data to achieve pay parity and achieve pay equality will say that it's actually been a useful exercise. And 3 years now, 3 years in or 2 years in, they are seeing how using data is helping them adopt that and internalize that agenda and actually make it part of everyday practice. So data will not be a magic wand. It needs to come with the kind of the culture change, but it's an important stepping stone, because data can help bring everyone together beyond that kind of emotional or political, or how are we going to address this issue through quotas or targets or other actions.
So who are the main people that you're working with? Is it the HR team? Is it D&I team? Just out of curiosity.
So we usually work with, depending on how large the companies are, we work with HR directors or with reward and compensation or people analytics departments to undertake this work. But it ultimately usually feeds into the CEO, and we increasingly see a lot of the data they get from Gapsquare feed into board meetings and decisions that are being taken at board level.
Well, fantastic. Zara, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. You've definitely provided so much actionable advice, and definitely going to get people thinking on this topic to take more action as well. And this leads us quite nicely onto our quick fire round. So I'm going to ask you 5 questions, and you have no longer than 30 seconds to give us some amazing answers. Are you ready?
Yeah.
What was the number one thing about that was holding you back from becoming a senior leader in your field?
I think myself. Really, it's just overcoming myself and what I thought was my limits, or were my limits, which were actually not my limits. I could push myself further.
Fantastic. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
This is really controversial, because we've had business advice that has always been telling us to take it slowly and go small at the beginning and grow up. And Actually, the best thing about it is that I didn't listen to that advice and actually decided to go big or go home and actually go for the big picture straight away.
I love that. And I'm exactly the same, by the way. I always say, jump out of the airplane and build your parachute on the way down. That's my approach. And it kind of definitely, it's stressful, but
Yeah.
it works out well
Yeah.
in the end as well. What's one book you'd recommend to our audience and why?
Yeah, so there's a new book out called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. And it's highlighting inequalities in everyday life, from the way roads are plowed from snow to all the way to the way schools are built or toilets are built in theaters, and how women have been excluded from that over history and how we can overcome that now that we know where we are invisible.
And could you share some internet resources that you use to stay up to date with current events around these topics we've been talking about?
The Gapsquare newsletter is a good resource because we pool a lot of those resources around equal pay, gender pay together. And also Gartner provides a lot of interesting research around why pay equity needs to be addressed now, why tech is a good solution for addressing pay equity now. And Harvard Business Review is also producing a lot of very interesting resources and research around equality and why it's good for business, why it has impact on your bottom line, on profitability, on performance, and a lot of that.
Amazing. Well, I'll link all of those in the description for everyone listening. If you're wondering, if you're sitting there writing down notes, and I'll put a link to so you can subscribe to the Gapsquare newsletter as well for you. And then last but not least, what's one thing about your business that you're most excited about today?
So when we started the business 4 years ago, the World Economic Forum was saying that it will be 217 years to close the gender pay gap. At the same time, they were saying that by 2030, we'll be in self-driving cars, and by 2030, we'll be waving people off to Mars. And yet, in 2030, we will still somehow be 200 years away from achieving pay parity. And what I'm most excited about is that we're using tech, the same tech that's being used for self-driving cars and for people sending people to Mars, to actually accelerate equality and make sure that by 2030, we all have equal pay.
Wow. What an amazing reason to get out of bed every day.
Yeah.
No, it's true, right? It's incredible. Also shocking, by the way, that statement.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's pretty crazy when you think about it and put it in that context. But look, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. I'm so happy you came on the show. This is such an important topic. And even for me, sometimes I'm like, I've done 200 episodes of this podcast, and why are we not having this conversation more? A lot of people keep, as you're saying, ticking the box, but we don't really see many companies making real progress in this space. So I really appreciate all of the work you do. And for everyone listening, obviously make sure you go and check out Gapsquare, follow Zara as well. On that point, just before you wrap up, if there's that one parting piece of advice you could give to everyone, what would that be? And where can they learn more about you? What's the best way for them to reach out if they want to learn more, connect with you?
Yeah, our website, gapsquare.com, is a good first point of contact. We have a lot of interesting resources about legislation around the world and how and why people use data to look at equal pay and gender pay and equal pay for equal value and any other fairness related issues in work. The one piece of advice would be to let data guide decisions in companies, because they will be decisions that will be most financially feasible. It will allow for focusing resources on where most impact will happen, and actually will allow us to progress on this agenda and move into a space where we have fair, equal workplaces for everyone.
Well, and in terms of getting in contact with you personally, website as well, or LinkedIn, what's best?
LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn, Zara Nanu, or
Fantastic.
Twitter. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, guys, as always, if you head over to hrdleaders.com, you'll find the show notes from this episode. Everything that we've been talking about will be linked to the description. All of the links that have been mentioned will be there to make your lives easy as well. Apart from that, thanks so much for taking the time out to join us, and I wish you all the best until we next speak.
Thanks, Chris.